Hello, romantics. I'm Sarah Gomez, author, romance lover, and host. You're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast centered around writing, reading, and story structure, all with a twist of romance. We're at episode 72, and on today's episode, I speak with award-winning women's fiction author Kimberly Packard about making characters vulnerable, being her first reader, and how emotional arcs bond us to characters. Kim is a favorite reoccurring guest on the podcast, dating all the way back to the very first interview I did for Romancing the Story. She released her 7th book this time around about one woman's time travel journey to right wrongs and take second chances. We chatted about monitoring levels of emotional investment and how to know when to pull back as writers. We even delve a bit into changing writing tense partially through her book, taking time to process our characters' emotions, and respectfully, lovingly, calling women's fiction the trash can punch genre since it has a little bit of everything. Links to connect to Kim, as well as other media mentioned, will be listed in the episode description. I do use some Amazon affiliate links for books, so if you buy through the link, it helps the podcast and is always appreciated. I'm starting a new segment at the end of each episode to tie into the topic of the discussion. Let's tentatively call it Sarah's Stories. Did you know that Kim's novel this time around was a big part of another podcast episode nearly 2 years before it was released? Stay tuned after the show to hear more. With that said, let's jump right in.
It's still women's fiction. I mean,
Okay.
So it's funny, like there was kind of a movement within the publishing world a year or so ago, like, does women's fiction still exist? Or is it all the subgenres below it? And I think they've kind of come around to saying, no, it still exists. So, I mean, romance can be part of women's fiction, historical, all that. So, I mean, it still fits within women's fiction, but it's actually probably a little bit more of a romance than my other books. No, I don't necessarily follow the beats exactly, but I have that happily ever after.
And I do think there is romantic elements in there.
There are.
People love that. Welcome, award-winning women's fiction author Kimberly Packard. Yay!
Hi, thanks, Sarah. I love being back.
I know, Kim, you've been on the podcast several times. You know the lowdown, but in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Yeah, well, okay, first of all, I'm sober this time. I think the last time I was on, we had done the our writer's retreat and we'd had some champagne and we were kind of giggly. So everyone should know I've had coffee and lots of water today, and that's it. And I am, as Sarah said, I write women's fiction, which is it's kind of a very large genre that can really include pretty much anything within it. It can include some romance, it can include historical, some thrillers, all that. I lovingly call it the trash can punch genre because it's a little bit of everything mixed together. So, I promise it's not going to be all about drinking today.
I do love all the drinking metaphors, though. That's pretty funny. Apt for a Friday, right?
Right. Yeah, we are recording this on a Friday afternoon, and it's an absolutely gorgeous day outside. So maybe we got the little Friday sillies starting already.
But you call it like what the trash can punch?
Yeah, I'm sure there's some people clutching pearls out there on that one.
But it's so true though when you say it like that, because I know we talked about on a previous episode that like listeners love, when I was just telling you about it earlier, is you're mixing romantics with women's fiction. And like there's so many pieces that you can put into women's fiction. And I know you've done that before, like a little bit of action adventure there with Vortex, a little bit of, and Phoenix actually, and then a little bit of drama with Dyer's Club. So like you can add a little bit of anything with that women's fiction.
Yeah. And that's why I'm kind of glad that it's a genre that exists. Because even with this time around, this one adds in the extra element of a time travel, a time slip. And that's also part of women's fiction because there is this, there's been a handful of novels that have come out in the last few years that have time travel elements to it. And that still falls under women's fiction. So we are a very wide tent and everybody is welcome.
And for women's fiction, just so like in case listeners are like a little like, what do you constitute as women's fiction? Like, I think it's described as like, well, in your novels at least,
Mhm.
it's like it's predominantly the protagonist is a woman and it's
Yeah.
based on her emotional journey, right?
Right.
Is that usually
Right.
how you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is predominantly women protagonists, and they are on some emotional journey. So that's kind of that one thing that glues us all together. Now, it doesn't mean that they're only women characters. Like in Dyer's Club, I have two male characters that are POV characters, and same with my Phoenix trilogy. I have a couple of men that are POV characters. But outside of those characters, there's a female central figure, and it's her emotional journey.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
that's kind of how, like, I know you have approached your novels too, like outside of just like the normal genre expectations, that you usually have a very strong emotional arc and
Yeah.
tie with your characters. And the same goes for your latest release this time around.
Oh,
Congrats.
thank you.
Book
I love this
baby.
little story.
It is such a fun story and it's such a perfect like little beach read. Like, and I'm not just saying that, like I love it because it's nostalgic, it's like fun, it's kind of, it has the emotional ties, but at the same
Yeah.
time it's kind of popcorny, like a
Mhm.
popcorn kind of novel, I guess. I that's how I would describe it because
Yeah.
it just gives me all the feels. Like it gives me all the right feels, like for like a beach read now. And I'm sure to feel happy afterwards. You know what I mean? Not to spoil
Yeah.
anything.
But yeah, I mean, and it's a departure from me because it's written in first person present, where I typically write in third person past tense. So I kind of had to relearn to write a little bit. It's funny how your brain gets locked into one way. And then I was joking with our writing friends that nobody dies. That's a big spoiler alert because and I realized that in most of my books, that's usually a turning point. So spoilers for those if you haven't read them, but I'm like nobody dies. I had plans. I had plans to kill someone in this book, but Josie saves the day, my main character.
I remember we talked about that on the retreat. We were discussing it, and you were just like, you're human and Han, if you should or shouldn't kill the character. And like how it would like affect Josie and everything like that.
Yeah.
So like it is a huge departure. You are like, right. I didn't think about that you had changed the tense and you get a kind of further along the book before you changed that, like the POV?
Yeah, I think I got like 5 chapters in, and yeah, I'm trying to remember how that conversation started. Like we were talking about it, and then I talked to another writer friend, and I sent her one chapter in first, and then one chapter in third, and I was like, okay, which do you like better? And she's like, first person. You got to do the first person present, and it makes sense with to do first person, you would almost want to do it present, and really kind of getting back to the emotional arc idea. I think once I did get my groove going and I was like, okay, now I know what I'm doing. I kind of hit my stride. It worked really beautifully with Josie because she's having to unpack a lot of, in this story of what happened. So essentially for those who may not have seen the blurb, Josie is a soon-to-be single mom. She's going through a divorce, trying to have a great relationship with the ex, but he drops a bomb on her that he wants full custody of the kids. And that also falls at the same time that she, is a business owner, kind of, struck out to make a big deal, but the deal fell through. And so she was at risk of losing both her kids and her business within the span of like a morning, you know, and she had a panic attack, as one would. And she then wakes up in her teenage bedroom 30 years in the past. And so at first she thinks this is a dream. Then she's thinking, okay, maybe I'm in some sort of like hypnosis. Maybe they just gave me some really good drugs. Like there's a point where she's not really believing it. But then she kind of starting to think, I think this is real. I think I'm actually here. And so it worked to be in that first person present because we're unpacking it with her as she's unpacking it and kind of coming to this realization like, holy crap, I'm in the past.
Yeah, and I remember discussing a little bit about it when you were kind of fiddling with the idea of guys, crazy idea. What if I go like first person present?
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, Kim, you are so much more courageous than we are. But at the same time, we were like, oh, but it makes sense. You go so
Yeah.
much deeper, especially when you got the added complications of two very different timelines,
Right.
right? And then
Mhm.
kind of like coalescing into this one
kind of this one moment of like with Josie. So like to be in her head quite a bit can help us attach to her as an audience for the emotional piece of it, because that it hinges so much on that.
Absolutely. And whereas like my other novels, I usually have multiple POVs. We're only in Josie's world.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so it did make sense that, okay, this is the way this one needs to be told. So, when I have Chrissy's blessing to go first person present, it was the right, and that's a dear friend of ours. And, she has some very strong feelings.
She does. And she's our editor and
Yeah.
in chief over here. So
Yes,
in our
yes.
little writing group. So yes,
We
if
had her blessing.
yes, we have her blessing. It's all good. You know that.
Right.
So, and like, as you said, it's kind of like it's a women's fiction time travel novel about a middle-aged woman who has a panic attack, slips 30 years back into her senior year in high school. Like I said, really a lot of heart, funny references to the 90s. And I feel like it's just a love letter to giving our past selves the chance to reconcile mistakes.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it is such a heavy departure from like Dyer's Club. That was the last time I think one of the last times we talked on the podcast. And Dyer's Club was amazing, but very like, ooh, heavy in the feels. So what kind of made you go from one end, like one deep end of the writing pool, to the completely other side?
Oh gosh, well, swimming laps, but actually, yeah, you're right. Dyer's Club I still think it might be the book of my heart. I love that story. I love the characters. But if for those who maybe haven't read it yet, it is a story of a group of people, they're strangers who are all facing some sort of terminal illness, and they come together to do their bucket list trip. So I kind of jokingly call it's the Breakfast Club meets the bucket list. So I was finishing that book up and editing it and getting it ready for publication in the spring of 2020. And we all remember that. And I had to kind of put it aside, even though it was largely ready. I was giving it some edits and final pass. I really had to set it aside because the world was a very heavy place. Sarah was actually part of when the very first words of This Time Around were written. We did back in that summer when everything was in lockdown, we had our parking lot writing dates where Sarah and two other friends, Susie and Chrissy, and I would come together, and we would bring our lawn chairs, we'd bring our laptops, we would meet in a parking lot late in, evenings. It went cooler in Texas, and we would sit outside and socially distance and hang out together and write. And I had this idea rumbling around my head for a little bit of, what if you could go back and tell your younger self? Because, it's a phrase we say often, oh, if I could go tell my teenage self. And around that time, a friend of mine from high school had posted on Facebook some videos that he had gotten digitized. And I'm in one of them. And it's like my, 17-year-old self. And I knew it was my senior year because I could tell by the senior shirt I was wearing. And it was really weird because it was like I was looking at myself in the past, and it was different than looking at pictures. I'm seeing myself in video, I see myself interact. And it was like, wow, who was that girl? Because she feels, it's me, but it's not at the same time. And I think that, having that rumbling around in my head and the need to write something a little bit lighter and just, thinking like, gosh, what could we do? That nostalgia, go back in time and tell ourselves, it was my break from the heaviness of the world and the heaviness of Dyer's Club.
And that's kind of what I remember. I think we chatted about at one point. Like, I remember thinking like, oh, this is such a good palate cleanser. Like Dyer's Club is so awesome, but it's like one of those like books that you read and you sit down and you think about for a while. But this one felt like very much like just a very lighthearted, like just like you said, it's very interesting seeing ourselves from the past and kind of like kind of addressing that in a lighter manner, quote unquote. So no deaths.
No deaths, no one dies.
Yeah. And something I think like that really was highlighted in both Dyer's Club and of course in This Time Around, since we kind of just stuck with Josie on in this POV for this while, is we've always, all of our writing group has always commended you on the ability to build emotional connection with readers. Like you have such a talent for that. And This Time Around is no different. We move from one moment to the next, understanding the reward and repercussions of characters' decisions. How do you build the emotional impact for the character so it creates the right arc for the story?
Oh, that's a good question. I was joking with Sarah before we came online that I was like, gosh, you're making me sound smarter than I am, or at least I feel. But really, I think the key, at least the key for Josie, was letting her be vulnerable. And I think that's the key for every, character. I don't try to write, I mean, I try to write really fierce, headstrong, characters, people that we would want to be friends with, I try not to write anybody who's a pushover. But at the same time, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say, I don't have all the answers. And that was, part of Josie's arc too, was that, she was having to rely on other people to tried, unfortunately, there was nobody with a time machine to get her back. So, but she was trying, doggone it, to see what her options were in 1994. That was part of her vulnerability, was having to rely on other people. And I think that was part of, as I'm writing the story, was what is Josie going through? There were moments where she was almost feral trying to get back to her time, but then she, part of the journey back was she got to reconnect with people she hadn't seen since high school, including her dad, who passed away while she was in college, including, the quote unquote boy next door that she had, kind of pined for over the years, and including one of her high school best friends who had kind of drifted away. So there was this moment of like, enjoying that past, that visit to the past. There's that saying that, the past is the one place you can never visit, so enjoying that vacation to her past and the people in her past, but also just that need to get back, that, I need to be with my kids. I need to make sure I, try to do whatever I can to get back to my timeline.
Well, and that's such like that goes so well for Josie in particular, because I know too that she runs her own business, kind of like you mentioned before, and she's very much kind of like a woman who's kind of on top of it. So like, or she tries to do all the things, right? And she kind of tries not to show that on the outside, that she may not have it all together, and I think that's just a struggle we as women have. We sometimes, we have problems asking for help. Yeah. And being vulnerable. Right. So, and you managed to make the characters' emotional arcs both complementary and diverse in this time around. You kind of mentioned it, like she has her kids and her business in the present, but in the past, she knows that all these other things are going to happen. Like she drifts away from her friend, her father passes away, and she loses the boy that she's, that could be the love of her life. So you have two versions of Josie, the high school senior and the middle-aged mom, that are living one life simultaneously, but each version has their own emotional arc to reconcile. How do you build and balance the two different emotional tracks of your main character?
Oh gosh, it was really tough because, Josie in the past, she had that gift and or curse of hindsight, some things that she knew was going to happen. So she, being the woman in charge, she has a list of things she thinks she can fix. I'm going to fix all these things. Little things, big things, things she fixes some she doesn't. I wanted to also show that the more time she spent in the past, the more she was kind of starting to become high school Josie again. Which isn't to say that she was like, screw it, I don't want my kids back. She still wanted them, but there was that, there were a handful of scenes where she was just like, I'm settling in on a Sunday afternoon to watch MTV with my best friends, I mean, and not to have a phone, the phones and all that, like they were truly all watching MTV together. Because that was when you kind of think about, like, we didn't have the overscheduled times. We didn't have, that device stuck to our hands. We didn't have a million things to stream, So yeah, there was the moment of balancing that where it's like, who she was to who she's becoming. And, hopefully in some ways that, kind of settling back in and just realizing she doesn't have to be in control of everything led her to being the person that she is and who she will be, after the novel ends, because I would think my characters continue on after I finish writing the book. I don't think their stories end there. They're somewhere in a universe living their lives.
Yeah, they continue on, right?
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's fun to have that battling inside, because I don't think, I mean, if you guys were to listen to the battles that go in my head every day, you would wonder about me. Because that's the thing, we're not clear cut. There's always like, well, I could do this, but I really want to do that. But we have those internal battles all the time.
Right. And there is an element there. I'm glad you added that and touched upon it in the book, of that there's always going to be a temptation, right? Like whether you would end up in the future or the past, there would be probably something or other to tempt you to be like, but what if? what
Yeah.
if I stayed, you know?
Mhm.
And I'm
Yeah.
glad you added that to her emotional arc because it did kind of feel more like, I feel like it brought a realism and it brought a heart to it. Like, as far as like, it's not just a one track of like, I have to get here. I have to go back to the future, right? Back to the future.
Yeah.
Of
I
course.
know.
But it's more of a, but but I kind of want to stay though. I'm kind of
Yeah.
living a really good life and I could relive this whole track all over again.
Yeah, it's like the choose your own adventure books. I used to love those. And I would pop around and say, okay, if Jimmy jumps over the whale, he goes this way or whatever the story was. And sometimes I would go back and be like, okay, but what if he goes this way? What happens then? And it's something that, maybe this is my midlife crisis book where you kind of think about like, well, what happens, just as a small decision of, turning left instead of right, it's like Sliding Doors, that movie from, 15, 20 years ago. What if I had gone to a different college, met totally different friends, ended up in a different place, so there's so many just minor little divergence we could have taken in life to lead us to a different path. But at the same time, we're ultimately here, we're ultimately where we're supposed to be. So I'm getting really philosophical. And like I said, I've had nothing to drink today.
Nice.
Or is it a case of I was always going to be where I'm at, no matter which path I chose? And I think that was part of what Josie was having to grapple with herself was, am I where I need to be, or was there another path for me?
Exactly. And I love how you bring that trajectory kind of into the character. You kind of weave that throughout of like this idea of like, what if I stay here? Because to me, it added like more layers to that emotional arc, as opposed to like, I'm a mom, I got to get back to my kids. It becomes this idea of like this push and pull, I think, of, but what if I stayed here? Would my kids still exist? But would I lose my kids? And what if I get to do all these other things, right?
Mhm.
Again. So I love that you added that dynamic into the emotional arc because it could have very easily been a just kind of get back to my kids, which is still a very noble thing and very awesome, a great like kind of plot overall. But the fact that you add all these little more nuanced, kind of like an onion, like layering like an onion, right? Like all these nuanced pieces of the emotional arc to it to make it a little more, to me at least, impactful.
Well, and one thing, to that point, I didn't want it to always be Josie in her narrative going, I got to get to my kids, I got to get to my kids. But what I would do was sprinkle in things that she would remember of her children. There's a chapter that starts where she's waking up. The calendar day where she's at is her son's birthday, and she's cranky because she's not there. And it's just, it's a big emotional day. And it happens to be a day that she has a major meltdown. There's another chapter where she starts thinking about her daughter and how she almost lost her daughter in a crowded store, and just that visceral feeling of nearly losing her child. But it made her think about like kind of how she's feeling now with that. I think it's kind of like, say something without saying something. That's what I was trying to do with it, is just sprinkling in memories. So they're always on her mind, even if she's not in her narrative saying, I got to get back to my kids.
Right. And I think that makes it all the more like you feel their presence, like you feel them and you feel them missing from her life, because the fact that they're not in her periphery, like she doesn't directly see them. She's not directly interacting with them. It's the little pieces that like almost like a puzzle piece. Like she's like, it's missing a little bit because it reminds her of that. So it's beautiful. Like the emotional arcs are such a key element, I think, in how we connect to both the stories and their characters. So how do you take into consideration to make emotional ties believable and impactful? Because that's what I feel like this one did.
Oh, thank you. Well, my biggest fear going into it was, if I didn't have her if she wasn't pining too much or enough with somebody who's a mom going, oh my gosh, she should only be thinking of her kids. But so that was the thing was, I wanted to get it across, but not make it too heavy-handed. But really, I think, truly, once I kind of get fully into a story, again, it's going to sound really woo-woo, but the characters really drive the story. They are, once I'm plugged into them and I'm tuned into them, they're telling me the story they want to tell. And so I think that was, being able to just realize that for Josie, it was that, as I was saying earlier, the battle against, going back to the past and seeing people she hadn't seen, it's at the cost, at least at that point in time, of not having her kids with her. There was, at least momentarily in this book, that trade-off of, okay, well, you don't have them, but you've got these guys. And then, finally having her settle in, because, this is the thing is, at this point in our life, we've all lost people. And, what I wouldn't give to have, another day with, I had a best friend who died in a motorcycle accident, nearly 20 years ago. And, what I wouldn't give to have one more day with her, or one more day with my grandmother, those folks in our lives. So I think thinking about that with Josie, and thinking about, like, gosh, there's a lot of people out there that can connect with that you get that one more day with that person that you miss, and that, she really did truly enjoy that time with her dad and the story, and her friends, and even, Daniel, the love interest, kind of seeing that through fresh eyes.
Exactly. And I remember too, that was actually a discussion, not to like talk about all the behind the scenes, like writing stuff, but I know it was a discussion we had about, like, I remember you asked like Christine, I think, and Susie, like, hey, is this too much of like focusing on the mom aspect
Right.
of it?
Right.
Because we are, as women, multifaceted, right? Like,
Right.
children might be very important, but then, like, as like, there's so many other things going on. And now that the world is so much more fast paced and everybody's always like, get it done right now, it's kind of like there's all these things going around, and then you going on at all times. And like you said, sometimes we miss out on those little moments where we could have that one more discussion, that one more talk, sometimes with our friends and family. So for this time around, did you have to alter any of the character's emotional journey because it wasn't working as intended, or you took a direction you didn't anticipate?
I didn't really have to alter anybody. Like I was saying, there were times I was I'd have to pull back and question, like, okay, is it too much? Is it too little? Do I need to do more? Like, yes, I let kind of Josie tell the story, and I was typing it for her, but I did have to pull back and say, okay, I want to make sure that we're going on the right path, that we're not getting too far off. And there was a surprise that I didn't expect, was that one of her best friends actually is going to have a book. So that was kind of unintended consequence, I guess. I gave myself enough of a gift that I set up Emily's story enough throughout Josie's story that I'm like, well, I actually did have to go back and change one or two things in the beginning to kind of make it mesh, with if Emily were to get a story. But aside from that, I didn't have to go back and change things too much, but I did have to stop and pull back and kind of think a little bit more, as I'm going through this journey with her, say, okay, are we on the right path? Are we heading in the right direction?
That's what I've always kind of felt like as a writer, and too, is sometimes I just kind of like lean back, especially in those like really pivotal moments. It's like, and say, like, is this working? Is this like, I'm gonna let it sit for a minute because I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's like that choose your own adventure. Like, in my mind, it's like, okay, if she goes down this way, what happens? But if she goes down this way, what happens? And that was actually, yes, there was a scene where we did have to, I had planned it to have this character die. As I was saying, someone dies in all my books. But when I got to that scene and I was writing it, Josie saves the day. And that was not something I was seeing. And that was not something I actually thought was going to happen. But then I sat back and I was like, but this was on Josie's list. It was something that and sorry, spoilers, if you're like reading the book and you're like, wait a minute, you told me. Well, sorry. But, it then realized that was something that she had early on. It was something that stuck out from her senior year of high school, of this death. And it was like, oh, okay, you know what? I'm going to let her have this win. And obviously what ends up happening then is that character kind of a slime ball, but he gets rehabbed. He kind of, later is like, well, if you thought I was worth saving, then I must be worth saving. And what we then kind of figure out is later, as, things change, turns out he and Josie become friends. And so yeah, there was that. I did not expect her to save him, but it also did not surprise me once I got there that, of course, Josie saved him.
Yeah, because I think it goes along with her character,
Yeah,
right? And like you said, all these things she wanted to fix, and ultimately that character didn't like impact the story enough to take her off track of where she
right,
was
right,
going.
right,
So,
right.
and if anything, I think it just added really character development for
Yeah,
her because it shows her who she is at her core.
yeah.
Something I didn't think about too, since you were mentioning like, hey, nobody dies in this. Is this actually the first book with an HEA, like a true HEA? Really?
Actually, yes.
I was wondering. I was just thinking about it. I was like, I'm pretty sure this is the first one, like a
You
true
know,
HEA.
I have been hanging out with romance writers for years. It was inevitable that you guys are going to rub off on me. No, I'm joking. I love my romance friends. I kind of joke that it's because of me that I'm like, I'm just not that romantic. I'm broken. So, but yeah, this actually, I've actually even said it's a bit of a rom-com, because Josie's a very funny character. She says a
I,
lot of funny things. So,
I can see that because didn't you kind of parallel it with like Peggy Sue got married? And I
oh,
think of 13
yeah,
going on 30 a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it gives me that energy of like this kind of like I said, just like a popcorn kind of like really nice beach read that's like really lighthearted fun. There's the emotional bits that you
Yeah.
want, but
Mhm,
like it has probably the strongest romantic subplot I've seen
mhm.
with your characters and an actual like an HEA.
Yeah,
So, but still in the women's fiction with like the
yeah,
time slip and everything going on in her emotional journey.
absolutely. So I just added in a fresh bottle of liquor to my trash can punch of,
I love it.
we got a little schnapps in
I
there.
know, got a little, oh
So-
my God, girl. Yeah. Oh, it's gonna be, oh, that is a true trash can right there, like true trash can punch. But that's also too, like that's a good piece though of mentioning that it's not really a romance because the focus isn't the romance, but there is a like a stronger romantic piece to it
Correct.
throughout the book. So like it's one of those things though, right? That you try not to let the romantic subplot kind of take over, right? That mhm.
Yeah, and and it was funny because I guess that was because Josie, really was trying to figure out how to get back to her children and thinking like I got to take every single step the same. Like I got to make sure I meet, Peter, the almost ex at the bar and, our 20s. And I got to like she's kind of then determined like I'm just going to walk the same path. And but then, it's the whole idea of she wants to do that even though she knows their marriage is going to end in a divorce and she's going to have her heart broken, and all that. And then here is somebody that she feels for Daniel what she couldn't feel for Peter, but she can't let herself feel for Daniel because of the path that was on before. So I think because of that conflict that she was going through, it kept her from kind of going all in on trying to, hook up with Daniel. Now there's moments. I mean, she's not perfect. She doesn't have up that, that steel gate of nope, we're not doing this. She goes out with him a couple of times. They kiss. There's moments where her resolve falls, just like all of us. We're not
Oh yeah.
perfect.
Oh yeah, that's human nature right there
Right,
of just
right.
like what if I smooch him though?
Yeah,
Just a little, just
just
a
a little sweet.
little.
Yeah.
But I'm still thinking about like getting back to my timeline, of course,
Mhm.
and like with my own life. So something I am both in awe and envious of is your talent for the ebb and flow within a narrative, kind of like we've been talking about this whole time. You know when to go heavy in the feels and when to pull back for breathing room. We kind of
Yeah.
mentioned that earlier. You never give readers whiplash, which I am always grateful for when I'm reading your books. I love it. It just flows so well. What's a good measure to know if your narrative is working to invest readers in the story instead of detracting them?
I always say that, I am my first reader. So if I am working on a story and I am just like, and Dyer's Club did this because it was a lot heavier. Now there were some light moments in it as well, because I needed those and I knew the readers needed those. But if I knew that I needed to take a break from the book, like I needed to get out of my head and go for a walk and get away, like I was getting a little too heavy. And so, um, the same with this, like if we just came out of a really heavy hard scene with Josie, she needed some time to process, just like the reader needs time to process, just like the author needs time to process. We all have to take that, anytime something big happens to us, it's like, I gotta step back for a minute and just kind of think through all that. And I think a lot of, because Josie truly is a really funny person. I think a lot of her personality, her love language is humor. So she would process things kind of in a funny manner. And I think that kind of helped where, again, big emotional moments, but then it was like, man, some humor that would go alongside it. And there were even times where, that even though she's 17 years old, there's still the mom brain going on where she's trying to control people, control friends, and young man, don't you, to like appear, and I think those moments where you kind of see that out of place, Josie, also kind of gives the reader a little bit of a reprieve because they can kind of laugh and be like, can you imagine if you're, high school age and a reader or a friend of yours was like, young man, you're grounded. And it's like, what, There were even moments where she, again, was trying to be like momming her friends and her friends would call her out for it and be like, whatever, mom, So I think those little moments where, people called her out for being controlling or being, a little heavier, kind of added to the lightness.
Yeah. And I do actually too, I was thinking about it, and that does help a whole lot. I think that injecting the humor, I think sometimes that does take the sting out of like maybe heavier times, heavier moments. But also something I thought was really interesting is you do know how also to like coordinate your emotions correctly. Like, and when I say that, I mean like Dyer's Club, you kind of set it up as a heavier book. Like you go very deep in the feels. And while you do go deep in the feels and like this time around, it is like, it is appropriately so. Does that make sense? Like it is appropriately the depth that needs to be, as opposed to like, I'm reading it and all of a sudden I get a Dyer's Club level, like tank of heavy emotion. And I'm just like, ooh, I did not expect that. You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely. Well, and I think it's funny because Dyer's Club, first of all, the cover is dark. It's very, very dark. So I think just looking at it, you're going to be like, oh, no pun intended, this is a dark book. And it kind of is. It's a book about death. It's also very much, probably more so a book about life. This time around, that sucker is hot pink and purple and turquoise. And my cover artist who, her name is Sarah Hansen, OK Creations. She's amazing. I'm going to give her a plug, but she's done all my covers. We actually talked on the phone. We usually just email, because we're email buddies, but we talked on the phone. She's like, okay, I have a wild idea. And when she was telling me, it's like, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's go all into the 90s. So I think even from the outset, like, Dyer's Club, if we were in the ocean, I mean, we're plunging in the depths of emotion, and I'm making people, the readers, the characters, examine literally life and death. And like I said, while could have been a death in this time around, it is a lighter one. I mean, we're kind of just offshore. We can see the beach, we can see all of our umbrellas from where we're at. We're not there out in the depths. And I think that's okay, because I think there are times for darkness and there's very much time for light. And we need to have both in our lives.
Exactly. I love that. I love that idea and that notion, because you can't really have life without death. They just go hand in hand. So, and it's one of those things I think too, there's just a very appropriate balance. And that's a good gauge. I think what you were saying is like, what kind of cover could I imagine for this book is like, maybe can help you. It might help like provide a little bit of a compass of like, how deep does this well go?
Yeah. And she still confronts life and death. I mean, her
absolutely
she still has to, come to terms with the realization that her dad may still die, but she gets to have that more of that life. We're looking more at life in this book than death.
Right. And like the choices of like Josie's choices and righting her wrongs, and also or changing or getting back to the future. So it is too one of those things, I think, where you don't ever see like you said, an on page or on screen death. So, and it's never in context of, while it's sad, it's never in like a traumatic way.
Right. She's not having to process it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that makes a big difference as far as like, if it shows you on screen and or on page, trying to process that might be a little heavier as opposed to like after the fact, like time has passed. since this has happened for her in the future. So she knows it's coming, but she's also kind of gone through the whole stages of grief to where she's accepted it, and it is, just part of life, really.
Right. Right. And she does, we have kind of an emotional scene where she sees her dad for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of a fun scene because she comes home hungover, off trash can punch. See?
Of course. It all comes around. Yeah.
It comes back around. No, she goes to the senior kegger, and even though she's 47, she was like, there was a moment she's like, okay, is my tolerance 17 or 47? Like, she still makes bad decisions even at that age. But yeah, she comes home the next morning after a walk of shame from her best friend's house, and her dad's there. And it's the first time she's encountered her dad in the past. She's only been in the past, I think at that point, just 24 hours. And it's really kind of a funny scene where she's like, Dad, are you real? And he's like, are any of us real? Like, he's kind of messing with her because he knows she's hungover. And but it was really kind of fun to write that, because I'm not writing an emotional scene over a death. I'm writing an emotional scene over life, because she is having, again, she's not processing a death. She's processing scene, and there's still emotions. Like I said, there's people I would love to see one more day. And I know if I were to see them, my first emotion would be, is this real? Like, are you really there? And would have still some sort of emotional reaction to that. And to be honest, it was much more fun to write that scene.
I could totally see that. Yes. I'd be like, that would be a great scene. Was that a fun scene to write? That seems like that would be kind of like this, like she's overwhelmed, but she's processing this, like, no, are you here kind of moment, but like in a really good way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, she's got a lot going on, because she's like, still like, okay, I'm in my past, I'm hungover. Because she's kind of thinking it's a dream. She's like, can you get hungover in dreams?
That's right. Yeah. She still thinks the dream. Yeah.
Right. She gets home and she's trying to get some coffee, and she reaches for like the Mom of the Year mug, and she's like, that's not me. So it's just kind of funny that, like, just everything she's kind of going through. But then at the same time, it's like, my dad's here. Like, yeah, she's still processing it. It's just in a way, and hopefully it comes across to the reader this way, that it's heavy and there's a lot to process, but I'm still laughing as she's doing it. And, maybe in that moment, I'm laughing at her, not with her. It's a little more fun when you're processing that.
Well, and I think it goes to show that emotional arcs can be not just the bad things, could be the good things too. Like, and it's obviously a very bittersweet thing, right? But at this point, it's more of an upturn than a downturn for her in that moment. So yeah, just it goes to show that emotional arcs can kind of have peaks and valleys, right? And then there can be the good ones, the bad ones, the bittersweet ones. And then they're all just part of life. We have talked all about this incredible book that you wrote this time around. So where can listeners find your book, and how can they connect with you?
Oh, thank you. We can get This Time Around wherever you buy books. So it's wide. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. All the independent bookstores, they will have access to it. Ebook, print book, however you like it, you can find it. And then you can connect with me. You can go to my website, KimberlyPackard.com, and sign up for my newsletter. I have a New Year's resolution to send out a newsletter at least once a month, because I was so bad at it before that I think people would get it and be like, who's this person again? Why is she emailing me? So I'm trying to be a little bit better. And then on social media, I'm usually more on Facebook and Instagram. I've used TikTok about 6 times, so I'm getting there on TikTok. Actually, if you want to see a fun video of me unboxing this time around with the help of my cat, Oliver, go to TikTok and look up Kimberly Packard, and then Instagram. You can see how my cat loves an audience and a box.
Oh, Oliver. It's just yes, just typical cat. He's such a character. I love Oliver.
I'm really surprised he hasn't joined us.
I know. I halfway expected like a cat just to come roaming around at some point. So
I know he's going to be really sad when he wakes up from his, nap and is like, I missed something. So.
Thanks so much to Kim for joining the show. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. That way you're the first to hear new episodes when they drop. And if you get a chance, feel free to leave a review. It helps support the show and allows more opportunity to bring in all kinds of fantastic guests. For today's story, Kim mentioned that I was present during the first words of This Time Around, and because of that, helped give feedback during the work in progress stage. So, of course, when Kim asked for a critique on the blurb for her story, I knew I could help using the podcast. On episode 34 of the podcast, I asked professional book blurb writer and coach Jessie Cunniffe to walk through a blurb audit using Kimberly's blurb from This Time Around. We talked about the good, bad, and unruly parts of the blurb process. But for the most part, Kim nailed the blurb premise and clear vision of This Time Around from the very beginning. Highly recommend if you'd like to hear a little behind the scenes for Kim's novel or are interested in how to write better blurbs for your books. As always, stay safe, be well, and keep writing. Bye!